So
So what are like some of the like people claim like okay, there's a text that's proof. Some people in I think California have looked for circular shaped rocks.
right, right, the anchors, the ship anchors. Um, they're not fake, but they're not ship anchors. See, one of the issues that always makes me crazy about, mystery hunters. When I hear the term mystery hunter, I start to grind my teeth. People who search out mysteries, and mysteries are fascinating. I'm not saying, I got into this field from sitting when I was, 7, 8 years old, sitting on the living room floor watching Leonard Nimoy on In Search of. So that's how I got into this. So I understand the draw and the romanticism of mystery hunting. The problem is, most people who do this mystery hunting, they don't get any expertise in anything. If you want to study, for example, if you want to say, okay, Leif Erikson, we know Leif Erikson came to America before Columbus because of the Vinland sagas. Can you read the Vinland sagas? Can you read them in their original language? Well, no, not really. I do the translation. Well, then you're not really reading the Vinland sagas. If you are studying some Native American group, if you can't read their language, you're not getting the full story. Excuse me. If you can't read ancient Egyptian, how are you going to tell me you know who really built the pyramids? And one of the things that always made me crazy about this is in those supposed stone anchors. They were found off the coast of California. They find them every once in a while. They're about the size of a frisbee, and they're stone, and they have a hole seemingly drilled through the middle. And when they were first discovered, people thought, oh, in ancient times in Japan and China, sailors would take these stones and carve them into sort of like a donut, like a stone donut. And the hole in the middle, so you put the rope through, and they would use these as an anchor. You get to where you're going, you don't want to be floating around, you throw this stone donut anchor over the side, and that holds you in place like any anchor does. And so it was the belief that, well, this must be proof, physical proof, that Japanese or Chinese sailors had come to Southern California way before Columbus. And the anchors they were using, some of them broke, you lose them, the rope gets frayed, and the thing falls down to the bottom of the water there. This must be proof that these sailors came here with their Chinese, Japanese boats, and these were their anchors, which on the surface seems logical enough. The problem is they're not stone anchors because geologists, real geologists, looked at these things and they said, these are not anchors. These are naturally occurring stone concretions. You find them all up and down the California coast. Because of the vagaries of where the ocean currents go, you wouldn't think this was possible, but the oceans can actually carve these things over long periods of time. And then they settle to the bottom, and mystery hunters come along and say, oh, I found a Chinese anchor. They're not actually anchors, they're naturally occurring stone formations.
Yeah.
And so you have that problem. Yeah.
So the real anchors, so you said the naturally occurring ones are like frisbee size.
Yeah.
Uh, would they have made bigger ones or
Yeah. It all depends upon the size of the ship, you know. If you're in the U.S. Navy, for example, they don't put the same size anchor on a coastal gunboat that they put on a aircraft carrier. Because the aircraft carrier is a much bigger object, and so you need a much bigger anchor with huge, thick chains that you wouldn't put on a smaller boat. And so these guys likely did the same thing. If you have a big boat, you want a big anchor. Got a little boat, you got a little anchor. And so there's just yet another example of how people who are sincere in trying to figure this stuff out don't have the background knowledge to understand what they're looking at. One of my favorite parts of this book is I call them the inscription hunters. There's a long tradition of people finding inscribed stones. It started in New England with so-called rune stones, and then as you work your way out west, you find similar things out there. These are supposedly stones that early people, pre-Columbian people, carved messages into. The two most famous are probably Dighton Rock, which originally was in Rhode Island. I think it's since been taken out of the ground and moved to a secure, like little museum building. And then, of course, there's the Kensington Stone, which a lot of people know this. It's a sort of a tombstone-shaped slab of rock with supposedly runic words carved into them. The Kensington Stone is fake. It's a modern fake. The Dighton Rock is a little different. The Dighton Rock really isn't a true fake. It's carvings that were done probably by Native Americans. And so in that case, in that way, it's not fake. But people think, because they can't read the written language of the Narragansett people. The Narragansetts are the ones who lived in that region. The Bay of Rhode Island is still called Narragansett Bay after these people. And so it became a really popular in inscribed stone to look at and say, here's proof that the Portuguese came here way before. But it's likely the carvings are all done by relatively modern Native Americans, not Europeans coming over before Columbus. But you see a lot of this stuff. As you head out west, you see more of it. And there was this little sort of gaggle of amateur investigators, the inscription hunters, as I call them, who in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, poking around out west in Arizona, New Mexico, Oklahoma, would come across these stones that seemed to have writing carved into them. Now, not once did any of these investigators ever think, oh, these must have been done by the native people. They had a written language. No, native people didn't do it. They're not smart enough to do it. It looks sort of like, because I'm not a linguist and I don't know anything about Native American languages, and I don't know anything about European languages, and I don't know anything about the languages of the classical world. I can't read Latin or Greek or Hebrew, but I'm going to decide that these carved letters look like ancient Hebrew or ancient Greek. There's the Las Lunas Decalogue, for example, which is one of the more famous ones that people believe has Greek writing on it. The one in Oklahoma supposedly got Hebrew writing on it. But obviously, well, if that's so, then that means ancient Hebrews got to Oklahoma somehow, and ancient Greeks and Romans and Carthaginians. One of the fascinating things about this whole story is that you basically can't spit without hitting an ancient culture that someone doesn't claim got to America before everybody else. The most obscure ancient civilizations, there are people out there who say there's evidence they came here first. So, in Oklahoma, you got ancient Hebrews, you got ancient Greeks and Romans, Carthaginians, all running around carving stuff. But all these carvings, they're not from the Native Americans. They're from these outside groups. And this woman, Gloria Farley, who had no training in anything. That's another constant you see amongst the outsider authors. They have no training. They're not trained as historians. They're not trained as archaeologists. They're not trained as geographers. They're not trained as linguists. They're just enthusiastic people who go out and think, I'm smarter than all those historians, not because of my extensive education, but because I don't have an extensive education. The reason you shouldn't trust historians and linguists and archaeologists and anthropologists is because they're trained in their job. So the more educated you are, this thinking goes, the less you can be treated because the dumber you are. Now, if that sounds insane, it's because it is.
Perfectly logical thinking right there.
There's no comeback for that. Even to this day, I mean, I get yelled at on, excuse me, I get yelled at on social media all the time. And the biggest insult that people think they're giving me is, you don't know about this because of your fancy PhD. That means you don't know what you're talking about. I know what I'm talking about. I've been out there in the field. You haven't been out there in the field. Actually, I have been out there in the field, but I've been out in the field. I've looked at the stuff. I've held the stuff. You don't know what you're talking about. You shouldn't be believed. I had a guy tell me once, I used to write a lot of op-ed pieces about controversial topics. I haven't done any while, because of COVID and other reasons. But I used to write 3-4 op-ed pieces a year, usually on controversial topics. My feeling is, if you're not going to write about something controversial, why bother? And I've written about abortion, and I've written about gun laws, and I've written about immigration, and I always get tons of hate mail because of it. And once I was asked to do a op-ed for Columbus Day, and I was just starting this book. And I thought, sweet, I can do, I'll do that, sure. So I write this, 750 word op-ed piece in which I never once disparaged Columbus. I could have called him an opportunist. I could have called him a slaver, all these things he was, but I didn't. I just, the point of the op-ed was to say, there are all these other legends about Leif Erikson and Fusang and, not just the Columbus story. And I got a bunch of hate mail over it. And my favorite was this guy who was a member of a local Italian American society wrote to me this 2-page type letter, like on a letterhead. Society, they had letterhead. Their society had a letterhead. And he sends me this 2-page thing, basically telling me I'm an idiot. I don't know what I'm talking about. How dare I say this? And he ends his letter by saying, my op-ed shows 2 things. I don't know what I'm talking about, and I hate Italians. And I said to the guy, dude, how can I hate Italians? I love ziti. I love pizza. How can I hate Italians? Come on. What are you talking about? And the other one, my other favorite, was this guy wrote to me, and he said, at the end of this long hate letter, he says, what you wrote, I don't even remember what it was I was writing about. He says, your op-ed just goes to prove that you're one of these uh, run-of-the-mill socialist professors. And I wrote, initially I wasn't going to write back, but I said, oh, okay, I'll write back to this guy. And oh no, he said, typical. You're just one of these typical socialist historians. And I wrote back and I said, sir, you're wrong. I'm not a typical socialist historian. I'm an outstanding socialist historian. And so I didn't get anything back from him. But we're at the 1 hour mark. So why don't I finish up with probably the legend or the myth that most people are at least vaguely familiar with. I'll talk about the Viking theory. And in order to understand the Viking theory of discovery, you have to understand there's two versions of the story. There's the story that's based in reality, and then there's the story that's based in mythology. The mythological story comes first, and it's only later, in the 1960s, an archaeological site was discovered in Newfoundland at a place called Lancel Meadow, that was definitively proven, and there's still a dig going on there, was definitively proven to be a site, a community that was built by sort of Scandinavian explorers / farmers. The artifacts have been found there. It's really beyond question that this was a site 500 years before Columbus where Nordic people, Scandinavian people, had come to North America. So we know that even amongst Europeans, Columbus wasn't the first one here. These Nordic, until we find other evidence, these Nordic people, they were the first ones here. So that's the reality of the Viking discovery myth. And I mean, even the term Viking is hugely problematic because it doesn't really start getting used until the 19th century. It comes into wider use because of the German playwright Richard Wagner. You know, he's the guy who, like, you're sitting here right now, people are sitting here right now listening to this. When you hear the term Viking, an image pops into your head. That is the image that Richard Wagner created. The helmet with the horns, you know, the fur and all. That's a 19th century construction. There were Norse pirates who made a living and rampaging and killing their way across Europe. They even got down into the Middle East and may have brought Islam with them back to Scandinavia. But that's the reality. The myth version, the fantasy version, involves Leif Erikson. And this whole story comes out of a medieval text, an Icelandic medieval text, known as the Vinland Sagas. And it's part of a much larger, the original is in Copenhagen, in the University of Copenhagen Library, this huge, thick medieval manuscript, handwritten, hand illustrated. And one small tiny chapter of it tells the story about a guy named Eric the Red and his wacky family. Eric is from Iceland. He kills a guy who kills one of his slaves. People don't realize that, you know, this Viking culture was a slave culture. He's forced to leave Iceland. He goes to the next big landmass north and he settles and he tries to turn it into a kind of real estate deal. You know how people will buy a tract of land and then they'll start building mansions on it. And then they try to attract people to move there. That's what Eric the Red does in what he now calls Greenland. Because if he called it what it actually was, which is a land of freezing cold weather, ice and snow, no one's going to want to go there. So he calls it Greenland. And he brings his family with him and they establish a sort of a plantation. And his son's name is Leif and his daughter is Freydis. And they start building this community. one of Leif's friends, a guy named Barney Herlufsen, he now wants to come over and live there too. So he gets a couple of Viking longboats together, and they full of stuff and friends. Again, imagine the carload of frat boys on the weekend with a trunk full of beer. They're going off to have fun.
That'd be a
So they're heading
treatment
to
by frat boy weekend parties.
yeah, the reality of history always blows people's minds. We think this is something we just invented. That the young guys never did this before. So Barney and his pals, they take the sea, and they're going to go to Greenland and join up with Leif and his dad, and they're going to get land because it's all free. They get lost, and they sort of drift west of where they're going. And as they're doing that, Barney sees in the distance, he can just see in the distance, a large landmass to the west. They don't actually go there, but they see it. Then they kind of figure out where they are, and they manage to, get back to where Eric and everybody else is, and they land safely, and everybody's happy. And Barney tells Leif, I saw land. Did you know about this? There's land west of here. Not that far. And so Leif decides, for some reason, Barney doesn't go with them. But I love the idea that if this story is true, because there's no outside confirmation, it's all from this text, it's all from the Vinland sagas. If it's real, the first European to see America is a guy named Barney. I just find that hilarious. I'm not sure why. I just find it hilarious that the first European to see America is a guy named Barney. They head west, and they get to this land because it's really not as for the way these Norse sailors travel. It's not that far, and it turns into a whole Goldilocks kind of thing. The first place they get to, it's awful. It's cold. It's not very inviting. They head south, find another place. That's a little bit better, but it's really rocky. And again, they don't really care for it. They head south again, and then they find a really nice place with trees and grass, and the weather's kind of pleasant, and they land there. And because, again, according to this story, this third place is sort of lush and green, and there are vines growing with grapes on them that everybody immediately starts eating and getting drunk off of. Leif calls it Vinland, the land of vines. And so that's where the name comes from. And so there's this whole story that, this legend starts to grow, that Leif creates a settlement and everything's hunky-dory. They have run-ins with the native people who at some point, either while they're there or later when the stories start getting written down, because remember, all these stories, as all medieval manuscripts do, start off as oral tales or oral histories. And then eventually much later, somebody starts writing them down. So we don't know whether this word comes out when these Norse people are there, or whether somebody calls the native people this later in the written text, but the native people start being called Skraelings. And there are some cases where the Skraelings and the Norse kind of get along. Some examples where they don't. There's one famous story where the Vikings, who supposedly have this reputation as these tough guys, macho alpha males, decide to raid a native village, and they're charging up the hill, waving their swords around, and suddenly the natives roll out a catapult that they've built, and they start firing rocks at the Vikings. And the Vikings get, this freaks them out. They run away, So much for that Viking macho image. And there's one example where Leif's sister, Freydis, she's a real piece of work. Freydis is the first, and once again, I keep having to do this caveat: if the Vinland sagas are accurate, if they're not just made up stories, like a lot of scholars think they are. She is the first European woman mentioned anywhere in a text about North America. Excuse me. When the Vikings run away from the native people, she gets angry at the Vikings. You're supposed to be Viking men. What are you doing running away from these Skraelings? She takes off all of her clothes. She picks up a sword and she charges the Native Americans, screaming and waving the sword around. And the Native people are like, who's this insane white woman? She must be like a sorceress or something. Let's get the hell out of here. So they leave, and she wins the day. She wins the field. The other great story, it tells you, I think, all you need to know about Freydis. She wanted to take over. She wanted to take over Greenland and take over Vinland from her brother and the other men, sort of become queen of Vinland. But her husband is kind of a milk toasty guy. He's not really tough, and she treats him badly. There was a little faction of men who realized what she was doing, and they're sort of become like the opposition. Freydis is kind of trying to take over. She's trying to steal from us, and she convinces some of her male followers, the people that she doesn't like. They all live in one house. She convinces these guys to break into the house and murder everybody inside. So they go in and they kill all the men, and then they come out. And Freydis is like, well, what about the women? And like, well, they're women. We didn't kill them. We killed the men. She gets mad. She grabs an axe. She charges in there and she hacks to death all the women inside there because she wants everybody dead. That's who this person is. So time goes by and the Vinland sagas get written. By then, Norse people have left North America, gone back to Greenland. They eventually even leave Greenland and go back to Iceland or Norway or Sweden. And so the Norse presence in North America is now gone. The Vinland sagas are written. It's a single manuscript. And scholars start coming across this Vinland saga manuscript. And they start putting two and two together, and they say, wait a minute. Vinland, if we sort of look at maps, and read the descriptions in the text, Vinland's got to be North America. And so the Vikings discovered North America. And it really kind of hits a chord. And you get a bunch of people here in the United States. This is by the 19th century. A bunch of people, early 19th century, a guy named Carl Christian Raffin publishes a translation of the Vinland sagas with a bunch of maps and things in it. He includes a drawing of Dighton Rock because he thinks that's important. He puts an English language introduction into this. It's called the Civitates Americanae. And this kind of spreads the word of this. And slowly but surely, you start to get people believing that the Norse are the ones who get here first before Columbus. But they need sort of a real good cheerleader. Enter Eben Norton Horsford, one of the great names in America. Nobody names their kids Eben Norton anymore. Eben Norton Horsford.